Hello, everyone. My name is Monica Lewis. I am the engagement manager at SMU DataArts. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm going to pause and give a brief physical description. I am a cisgendered African American woman in my mid-30s. I'm wearing a black sweater with straight black hair, and there's a white background wall behind me. On behalf of our team at SMU DataArts and our partners at Museums Moving Forward, we would like to extend our sincere thanks and appreciation for each of you for joining today's session as we explore the art of well-being, insights from Museums Moving Forward's 2023 report on U.S. art museums. Before I introduce my amazing and esteemed colleagues and presenters, I wanted to first take a moment to pause to reflect and honor the land. We take this moment to acknowledge the indigenous people of all the lands that we're on today. While we do come together on a virtual platform, we acknowledge the significance from coast to coast. We uplift the ancestral and unceded territories of all First Nations people. At SMU DataArts, we specifically honor the Apache, the Caddo, Comanche, Cushata, Tonkawa, Wichita, affiliated Kichi, Waco, Taiwaikone, and Lenni Lenape peoples, upon whose traditional territories SMU DataArts now exists. We invite you to share your own personal and local land acknowledgement in our chat, and our team will also share a native land while we encourage you to learn a little bit more about the Native community in your community. And forward, I'll share a bit of housekeeping. We're going to keep everyone on mute today, and that is to ensure the best sound quality as we are recording today's presentation. I do encourage you to take a moment to explore some helpful features located within Zoom, and that'll be a great platform to engage with our panelists today. So first, I encourage you to look at the Q&A feature for any questions that you may have about today's presentation. Feel free to drop those questions at any point in time. I will share we have a large audience, so we may not get to answer every question, but we do encourage you to share. We also have the chat feature that is available to you. If you have any trouble or if you have a comment that you would like to share, the chat feature is a wonderful way to communicate with our team. Behind the scenes, we have Katie Ingersoll, Rochelle Brisson, and Liz Levine, who will also be sharing links and responding to some of your questions. So you'll have a wonderful way to engage with us. And on our next slide, I'll share is that closed captioning is available to you. If you would like to activate that feature, you'll simply click the CC icon located on your Zoom dashboard. You'll then be prompted to view closed captioning either by subtitles or by transcript. If you need any assistance with any of these features, feel free to reach out to our team on the chat feature, and we'd be happy to assist you. And most importantly, our popular question is, will we be recording today? And I will share, yes, we are recording today, and we'll be able to share that recording with you in our follow-up communications. Now, to the heart of our time together. During our time together, you'll hear from our amazing panelists as they explore well-being findings from the Museums Moving Forward report. We'll then open our virtual floor for a guided discussion and conversation led by Elizabeth Merritt. And before we close our time together, I'll share a few ways to stay connected with SMU DataArts and Museums Moving Forward. With that, I'm excited to introduce our panelist and moderator, and I'll start with our amazing moderator. Elizabeth Merritt is an American Alliance Museums VP of Strategic Foresight and founding director of the Center for the Future of Museums, a think tank and research and development lab for the museum field. Elizabeth is the author of the Alliance's annual Trends Watch report and works with museums around the world to help them build for a better tomorrow. As Elizabeth has shared some really amazing links from AAM, and we're sharing those links in the chat feature right now. So we do hope you are able to explore those. I'm also excited to introduce our panelists and presenters. We have Dr. Jen Benoit Bryan, Diane Jean Mary, and Mia Locks. And I'll start with Diane. Diane is a cultural leader, speaker, and organizational strategist with over a decade of experience guiding the transformation of and leading creative and cultural institutions across the nation. Diane serves as the executive director for the Black Trustees Alliance, where she oversees all aspects of the Alliance growth and organizational development. We welcome Mia Locks. who is the Executive Director for the Museums Moving Forward. She is a research organization, Museums Moving Forward is a research organization devoted to envisioning and creating a more just museum sector by 2030. Between 2010 and 2021, she was a curator for the MoMA PS1, the Whitney Museum of American Art, and the Museum of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles. Nia is passionate about equity and leadership in the museum sector. And finally, we have Jen Benoit-Bryant, who is the Director of Research at SMU DataArts. Jen joined SMU DataArts after serving as the president for Slover Linnett's audience research. As a leader in arts research, Jen is passionate about prioritizing research strategies that pull in new voices, that are collaborative and co-create with communities, and also spark and support lasting change within arts and culture. During her time at Slover Linnett, Dr. Benoit-Bryant worked on a wide range of multi-year projects, including Museums Moving Forward. With that, I'm so excited to introduce all of these voices to our space. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to Jen to get us started with our research. Jen, I'll shift it over to you.
Thank you so much, Monica, for that great introduction and for helping get us all organized and ready to share out with everyone today. I am thrilled to be joined by this incredible group, and I'm just going to toss the baton directly over to Mia to give us some framing for Museums Moving Forward.
Thank you, Jen. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I'm Mia Locks. I'm the Executive Director of Museums Moving Forward. And yeah, I just want to say a thank you to our friends at SMU DataArts for hosting this event. And I would like to extend a quick thank you also to our funders at MMF, the Mellon Foundation, Ford Foundation, Tremaine Foundation, Terra Foundation for American Art, and the members of MMF's Vision Council for their generous support. And I also want to thank MMF's team, some of whom are here, and our board of stakeholders, our editorial council, and our advisory council, as well as the many, many other folks that have helped make our work possible. And finally, I always like to give a shout out to our 54 partner museums. I see a lot of you also in the audience. And yeah, your participation in the pilot study is what allowed this study to happen. So thank you for that. And then, yeah, just one more quick word about Museums Moving Forward for those that are new to our work. MMF is an independent, limited life organization devoted to creating a more just museum sector by 2030. Together with a diverse network of museums, cultural workers, and philanthropists across the country, MMF drives urgent conversations about the most effective ways to make and measure real change inside museum workplaces. Through data, discourse, and empowerment, MMF is committed to the evolution of museums toward equity, specifically by improving the working conditions and lives of cultural workers. So we're going to dig into that more. I'm really delighted to be joined by my report co-authors here, who you already heard about. But in addition to their work at Black Trustee Alliance and SMU DataArts, both have been really integrally, is that the word, involved with MMS work and continue to be, and I'm very grateful to them. So I'll just say, I think, a quick overview maybe about kind of the design and response, and then I'm going to pass it to them to dig into the data. So the study began really as an open invitation to all art museums to participate. The survey was open from data collection was open from October to December of 2022. And there were 3 levels of survey: an all-staff survey, an HR survey, and a director survey. And then there was this complex encryption process that ensured the privacy of all individual responses. And then just a quick note on the responses in general. We had the 54 museums I mentioned. We got 1,933 staff responses, which is a 26% response rate. And then, yeah, 90% of our museum directors and 90% of our HR directors completed their surveys. There is, I guess I'll pass it to Jem, but yes, we do know right out of the gates that there's overrepresentation of our full-time workers. And there's a whole host of reasons for that, but we always just want to note that. Yeah, Jen can say more, but I will pass it to Jen and Diane to dig into some of the data, and I'll jump back in at the end to talk about some of our conclusions.
Sounds great. Thank you, Mia. And we welcome questions about the framing and who is represented here. Although our focus really for this discussion is well-being, and so we've gone through the report with that lens in mind to really surface and center the insights that we have around 3 different types of well-being that we want to explore with you all today. The first is around career satisfaction and workplace culture, which is a really big topic and a big focus of the survey, and Diane's going to walk us through that. And then I'll share a little bit about financial well-being and career mobility, and then mental and emotional well-being through the lens of experiences of discrimination or harassment. So I'm going to hand it over to Diane to walk us through this first section and frame it up.
Thank you, Jen. And I want to kick things off first by saying that all of these topics are deeply intertwined. And so what happens in the workplace setting directly impacts how you feel about your job in that setting and how well you feel and what your financial stability is. So all of these are interrelated topics. For the purpose of parsing the report, we have broken them out into these sections to give them some clarity and some containers for understanding. So I'll kick things off with a discussion about career satisfaction and workplace culture. Career satisfaction is how workers feel about their roles in their institutions, and workplace culture is related to how art museum workers really situate themselves within the art museum. So workplace culture is the living embodiment of a museum's norms, its values, its ways of working. And museums are particularly unique, as are most cultural institutions, in that the workplace is both a public and a private setting. So you have the workers who are powering the cultural experiences, and you have those cultural experiences that are being experienced simultaneously by visitors. So I'll start with some good news, which is that overwhelming majority of art museum workers view their jobs as meaningful. They believe that they're doing purposeful work. They feel supported by their managers. They believe that they can learn and grow and that they can develop positive relationships with their coworkers. That is incredibly important to understanding the day-to-day experience of our art museum workers. And roughly half of art museum workers would recommend their workplaces to their loved ones, their friends, their family, those in their network. Interestingly, when you look at that across seniority level, executives are much more, or you can go back to that last slide, Jen. Executives are much more likely to recommend their workplace to their loved ones at a rate of 66% compared to 53% of museum workers overall. And it's also worth noting that 1 in 5 museum workers actively would not recommend their workplace to their loved ones. And a sizable contingent, 40% of art museum workers, believe that their workplace is actually negatively impacting their health. So we're talking here about physical health, mental health. This is especially true of workers who have experienced discrimination and workers who are navigating their disability status within their workplace settings. And when we looked at, why folks are either satisfied or not satisfied with their careers overall, it was really important for us to actually parse out dimensions that can be compared to US workers overall. We know that purpose-driven careers, museum work included, are often thought of as deeply meaningful, purposeful work that powers everything within the institution and the career of the individual worker. But some interesting findings came out when we looked at those dimensions across US workers overall compared to art museum workers. So if you see those pink bars on the right, that's where you can see the difference, the gap between satisfaction of US workers overall and art museum workers. So the two that I'll point your attention to are career advancement and pay. This is a story that was a very deep through line in our report, came up time and time again, no matter how we ask the question. These are the two dimensions that art museum workers are largely dissatisfied. So they're not satisfied with their level of career advancement, the opportunities for growth in their institutions, and they're deeply unsatisfied with their level of pay. So those are two that we want to attract your attention to and invite discussion on later on. The gaps are smaller in their feeling of job security and stability of pay, but the actual level of pay is something that workers continuously tell us is an issue for them. And this finding came across as fairly alarming to us when we first parsed the data, that 68%, the overwhelming majority of art museum workers, are considering leaving the field altogether. 60% have considered leaving their museum workplace for another art museum. And so you're seeing a real story emerge about retention in art museum workplaces. When you ask them, why are you thinking about leaving? Again, that dimension of pay comes back up in the story. 68% have said that their pay is too low, and that's a top reason why they might want to resign from their posts. Burnout is another huge factor for folks who are looking to consider other opportunities outside of the field. Lack of opportunities for growth, again, that theme of career advancement comes through here. For management in art museums, so a real reflection of the leadership of their institutions by their workforce. And lastly, they're being enticed and seduced by other opportunities outside of the field of arts and culture. So now I'm going to pass the mic back to Jen, who will take some of those threads of career satisfaction and workplace and dive even deeper into dimensions of pay, affordability, what's stopping career satisfaction in terms of advancement and those opportunities that workers are really looking for.
Thanks so much, Diane. I'm going to give a whirlwind tour of a couple of financial well-being and career mobility metrics, just keeping in mind that all of this is kind of fodder for the second half of our time together today, which will be the moderated discussion of what we're seeing here and what it means and what the actions are to activate it going forward. So I think perhaps another one of those turning points in our kind of understanding of what's happening in the museum sector was around the ability to cover basic living expenses. We saw that 71% of full-time workers, 74% of all workers can't always cover their basic living expenses with their museum salaries alone. This is more acute for BIPOC workers than it is for white workers, and it's more acute for those who are more junior within organizations than those who are more senior, perhaps not surprisingly. What was a little surprising, I think, to us was the fact that even among executives within art museums, about a fifth of them can't always cover their basic living expenses. So it's not something that is exclusively an issue for those at lower and middle levels of staff positions within art museums. And perhaps not surprisingly, pay satisfaction is extremely low among those entry-level workers. Diane walked us through this and how it related to pay satisfaction for US workers overall. And here you can see how it splits out across sort of seniority level within the institutions. I will say that this is an interesting skew from 18% to 62% at the upper and lower levels here. When we looked at sort of what that skew looks like for US workers overall by pay bands, we see a much wider skew. So it's interesting also to me that museum workers, even though there's a big range here between 18% and 62%, it's more clustered together. It's not quite as wide ranging as we see among US workers overall. The other side of that coin for a lot of people, if they're not getting paid very much now, is that maybe if they stay and work hard, they'll be promoted and will get to higher levels of salary that can be more sustainable going forwards. But what we're seeing is that on average, individuals who completed this survey had been at their institutions for 7 years already. But less than a third of those individuals had gotten any kind of promotion with a title change and pay increase beyond cost of living, which we think of as a full promotion. Less than a third had gotten a pay increase beyond cost of living, even if they didn't get a title change associated. And then very few are getting what we term hollow promotions, where you're getting that title change, maybe new roles added to your job, but without the accompaniment of additional pay. And we have a lot more on promotion rates in the full report, but just a sense that this doesn't seem to be the solution, right? This isn't the solve for that low pay. I do want to shine a light, though, on the fact that when we look at benefits beyond pay, that particularly for those who are in part-time positions, the benefits within art museums seem to be better than what is being provided by private industry. So in this chart here, you can get a sense of, in the kind of filled in red and purple bars, we see full-time and part-time art museum workers. And then below them, in the kind of white centered bars, we see full-time and part-time private industry workers. And the rates are relatively similar on the full-time side. It's pretty aligned, kind of art museum workers versus private industry workers. But on the part-time side, we see pretty consistently, I think with just one exception, that art museum workers are getting better part-time benefits than most workers in private industry. So I just want to acknowledge the fact that that kind of ancillary benefit beyond salary for part-time workers in particular seems to be helping to make up some of that ground that's lost. All right, I'm going to shift over to sharing a little bit about mental and emotional well-being, and I want to do that through the lens of experiences of discrimination or harassment in workplaces. And I want to do that in part because we know that workplace discrimination causes disengagement and it undermines well-being. We've seen that in a number of research studies, including a recent one at Gallup. We know that it has a pervasive effect, that it's not equitable in its impacts. It's more extreme in its impacts on Black and Hispanic workers. And we think that greater inclusivity really starts with an awareness of those effects and an understanding of them. And we see that more than a quarter of workers within art museums have experienced discrimination or harassment within their current institutions, knowing they've been there on average for 7 years, and that those experiences are felt unequally depending on your race and ethnicity. So here we can see a really wide range from 20% on the low end up to 39% on the high end of kind of rate of experiences having had any experience of discrimination or harassment at their workplaces. It was interesting to see the kind of breakdown of the types of discrimination or harassment that workers are sharing. On average, they're selecting a little over two of these different types that they've experienced. Gender was the most common, followed by age and race or ethnicity, but there were a wide range that we measured and tracked here. And we see just huge impacts of those experiences of discrimination or harassment on workers. We see those impacts come through really strongly in these emotions. So this is another difference chart. Here we're comparing workers who have had experiences of discrimination with those who have not. And the green bar on the right shows the magnitude of difference between them. And at the top of the list, we have some negative emotions, disappointment and anger, and a 2 to 3-fold kind of increase in the likelihood of experiencing those emotions through work if people have had experiences of discrimination or harassment. For positive emotions like contentment, inspiration, be feeling connected to your colleagues, to your work, we see lower rates across the board for those with experiences of discrimination. And it really is pervasive. It covers every single emotion that we measured here. There's a distinction, a difference depending on that kind of foundational experience of whether or not people are experiencing discrimination or harassment within their workplaces. An emotional state is a really important dimension here, but we also looked at how this tracks with respect to ratings of workplace culture and saw, again, consistently across every metric that workplace culture is rated worse by those with any experience of discrimination or harassment across every measure we tested, with huge magnitudes of difference, 2 to 3-fold differences in some cases. At the top of the list here, I want to point out a few of these. The fact that people feel like they have to hide some of who they are when working within organizations jumps from 19% of those without experience of discrimination up to 56% of those with them. We talked about culture of the workplace affecting mental and or physical health. Another one here is just likelihood to recommend. That halves, gets cut in half if you had an experience of discrimination or harassment at your workplace, which makes a lot of sense. Don't send your friends and family somewhere where you're having those experiences. But in effect, when we're in a place where there's a lot of people thinking about leaving jobs and it's a lot harder to recruit people, when you depress the number of people who say this is a great place to work, it's another sort of factor that's adding to this, the constraints and the challenges around hiring here. Okay, so we've gone through lots of things here. This is just the kind of tip surface of the iceberg in terms of what's available in the reports. We hope that you'll check the full thing out, but I want to hand it over to Mia just to frame up the kind of conclusions and recommendations coming out of this work.
Sure. Thank you both for that. And I'll be somewhat brief because I do want to dig into some more discussion on these things. But I just want to kind of like wrap up this portion by saying that art museum work is meaningful, which workers overwhelmingly said in the study. Diane mentioned that, it's 82%, which is really huge. I want to highlight that because I do think that sense that, things are frustrating or that we see, various challenges and opportunities for growth. There is this like bigger picture, which is that like the work is very meaningful. Workers believe that at all levels. But, these workplaces are really plagued with these structural inequities, and this isn't only sort of detrimental to workers, it's also in deep conflict with these broader stated institutional priorities about equity and diversity, which is the findings are pretty clear, and I won't sort of reiterate all of them, except to say that I think there's a real opportunity for especially those in leadership positions, even in any degree of management, certainly any kind of decision makers, board members out there, to really think about what we have sort of highlighted here as what we see as the opportunities for improving museum workplaces looking forward. At MMF, we really believe that museums can transform into these incredible spaces of collective growth. But we really need to root into what we're hearing about the lived experiences to really be able to do that. So just quickly, and these are complex issues, which we can talk about more, those kind of 5 pillars for us are psychological safety, just sort of the bedrock, emotionally intelligent leaders, which is probably the most critical of the leaders' toolbox today. Opportunities for growth, which you saw is really lacking here. That all workers really need a greater sense of career and professional growth pathways to feel excited about the future. So I think there's an opportunity to get creative there. And then, diversity retention plans, which is really a field-wide effort. And we can say more about that as well. And then finally, and probably most importantly, pay equity and transparency. One thing that was not mentioned, but I just want to bring up here is that 71% of museums are already sharing salary bands for open positions. And we think we at MMF believe it's time to share salary bands for all positions so that workers across the field can have a better understanding of the full picture of their career trajectories. So these are just a starting point. All this can and should be workshopped and discussed and certainly customized based on the specifics of each individual museum. But I'll just leave it there as we shift into some more discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Nia, and thank you, Diane and Jen, for the opportunity to talk to you about this fascinating data. I'm a total data geek myself, and I loved going through this report and thinking about potential implications and poking at it to see what we might tease out of it. So I pulled out some of my top of mind questions to throw to you today. Throughout the report, you compare the museum data to research from 2019 data from Gallup. And I noticed one of our attendees asked about that comparable data. Maybe we could post a link to that report in the chat as well. And you found that museum workers are less satisfied than US workers overall on every dimension of job satisfaction. For example, no surprise, you report the biggest gap is in satisfaction being pay levels, with 29% of art museum workers being satisfied with their pay compared to 54% of US workers. Given the general inequities between for-profit pay and nonprofit pay, maybe that's not surprising. But to me, more surprising was the fact that a smaller percentage of art museum workers report enjoying their day-to-day work, 57% versus 68% of workers overall. Yet often we hear museums talk about the quality of the work experience making up for low pay. So I'd like to hear your observations about that.
I'm happy to take this one. I think that, people are attracted to this field because it is meaningful, right? The majority, 82%, feel like they're doing meaningful work. But at the end of the day, these are still workplaces. And we also heard that a great deal of art museum workers are feeling the burden of burnout and the inability to be able to afford their own basic living expenses. Those are challenges that are more urgently felt than passion and meaning and purpose. And so there's a bit of that just survival mode and making sure that they can handle their basic costs, handle the stress that's placed on them by overwork and having a workload that's too large for them to handle every day. And ultimately, those factors really do shape who's able to afford to be entirely mission-driven and is a threat to diversity in the field. So one of the major things that we're advocating for through this research is building a workforce that can support a multitude of lived experiences powering these cultural experiences. So to be able to have a diverse cohort of not just entry-level workers, because they do exist, but to be able to have a diverse cohort leaders of the institution at every level. And in order for us to do that, we do have to address these burdens that are being placed on workers at every level. So pay, burnout is the two big ones that come up time and time again.
I just want to
Jen,
add, sorry, I just want to add to that really quickly to say that we didn't dig into it here, but it's something that is important, I think, which is that when you look at the kind of emotional experiences of workers across their kind of seniority levels in the institution, we see that actually it's the entry level folks that are are reporting the most positive experiences at work. And I think that's really important to remember, that when folks are coming into this field, it's a sense of meaning and purpose, but like they actually do have a greater sense of enjoyment of their jobs. They like their colleagues. They're coming with, I think, a lot of really just positive energy, excitement, happy to be there. And then something happens. The longer they stay, they get, we can get into it, but I think that's the opportunity that we're not focusing on as a field. Sometimes we talk about the need for diverse leadership, which is real. I support that. But sometimes I wonder if we might be going about some of those issues in the wrong way, which is to say, adding more diversity at the top, which we're seeing, which is positive, which should continue, can also and should also happen by better supporting the folks that are already here. And I know we can't keep every single person and promote every single person. We see that promotions are obviously slow and surely uneven, but there is also the most diversity by every metric at that entry level. And so I just want to say, like, there's some positivity, there's some real diversity. And what we want to see is that staying and that, being nurtured and supported, because that's the potential that we see getting kind of squashed in the middle. And I just wanted to kind of add that, because we didn't dig into this about the various spotlights in our report, but if you look at the report, we have these kind of beautiful single page spotlights that talk about some of these experiences at these different levels. And I just wanted to mention that as well.
I'm so glad you did, Mia, because there is that messy middle, right? The managers, the director level staff, who are frankly the most vulnerable in the organization to these issues of pay and burnout. They're being taxed the most in the organization, and also feel like their compensation isn't quite matching just the realities of their lives. Caretaking, both on the elder care and on dependent care, the affordability crisis in housing, all of that comes to play for those rising leaders in the museum. And they're the ones who are looking to leave the field with the greatest level of intention. The other thing I'll mention, because you brought up this like erosion of passion from entry level all the way up to the senior levels, is that the majority of art museum workers actually aren't in frontline visitor-facing roles. And so the actual day-to-day experience of being a comms person or an administrator tends to look a little bit more similar to workers in other industries, despite the powerful mission that's supporting the entire organization. So that's something that I wanted to call attention to as we're thinking about, the purpose versus everyday workday experience for these workers.
I know that Jen was saying to me just before we started the webinar that this provoked a deep dive into other people's research. And I wanted to mention one of the things I found when I was poking around is recent data saying the vast majority of people hate being managers and don't want to be managers because it's not a very rewarding job and it has a lot more stresses. Per your point, Diane, you get stressed from the top and the bottom. So there may be things that make that even harder to deal with in a job where you went in having aspirations to do more mission-oriented work.
Such a great point, Elizabeth. I'd love to pull one in. There's a study that I was just looking at by Laura Lee on wage equity and employee motivation in nonprofit versus for-profit organizations. And it's a little dated, so I'm going to just acknowledge that. But it does a really nice job of kind of contrasting this intrinsic motivation that brings so many people into the nonprofit world with the sense of disillusionment that they might face when they're in those organizations, when the values that are purported by the organization don't match with what their experiences are within that organization. And she looks specifically at wage equity across organizations. If you're in an organization meant to be doing good, and this is nonprofits in general, not just art museums, but if you're in that organization, but you're facing inequities internally, there's this sense of like cognitive dissonance around, how am I in this place that aligns with my values, but my experience of being a worker here is really misaligned. And so I think when we think about this contrast of museum workers versus, workers in industry more broadly, that there's there's an opportunity in alignment
Yeah.
with the kind of intrinsic motivations that workers tend to have at higher degrees when they choose those career paths.
I absolutely agree. I wrote an essay years ago called The Sacrifice Measure, talking about the fact that some people go into nonprofit work feeling like they're willing to give up some wages for the opportunity to do this good they believe in, but that collides with the reality of work, much of which isn't about the stuff that inspired you to go into it to begin with. One of the things I've struggled with is you see lots of very value-driven museums or other nonprofits, but trying to operate in a capitalist society with board members who largely work in capitalist organizations, there's inevitably this collision of values, which just causes so much pain. Well, I'm going to encourage you to keep an eye on the Q&A, which has a number of questions. But while you're looking to see if there's anything you would like to address there, I'm going to lob you another one from my thoughts. And this is top of my mind a lot when I'm dealing with museum directors, which is this research reports that 68% of workers are thinking of leaving the field. And from AAM's own research, most recently our snapshot survey last year, we find that 60% of museums overall are having trouble filling open positions. And this paints a troubling picture of the future of museum staffing. So I'm just going to put you on the spot and say, what are your major recommendations for art museum managers looking to increase retention? And given that money is a limited resource, what's the most effective way to allocate the money they do have between, for example, raising base levels of pay or providing training and opportunities for advancement that way, or wellness initiatives?
I'd love to jump in here because I have a lot of thoughts about this. One of the sort of recommendations we make is around emotionally intelligent leaders. And I really think that museums have an opportunity here to elevate that skill set by assessing leaders' performances, not just based on their kind of personal outcomes and what they're doing and how they're performing as an individual, but also in the way they're leading a team or managing a group or even just leading a project. We see the burnout cultures driving workers out. And it just feels like this is the moment where we can actually evaluate leaders' holistic skills. You know, there's things like, you know, and this is, it's not totally free, but it could be free, at least to start to just like think about capacity for self-awareness, ongoing reflection about how your actions are impacting other people. For sure, over the last couple of years, I think the ability to stay calm under pressure and to have empathy for others has been sort of happening, but no one's actually capturing that as an important skill that's meaningful, that's really helping these workplace cultures. And I think this is where I feel like we could add a metric for assessing emotional intelligence skills. You know, we could certainly have museums commit to 360 evaluations where, you know, we're getting feedback from all directions. But also like that leaders are kind of responsible for, again, not just their fundraising goals or meeting their kind of departmental goals, but really like how they're treating others, how, you know, their ability to sort of unlock potential in others, specifically, you know, POC folks or, you know, folks that are kind of new in the field, whatever, you know, whatever institutional kind of priority there is in terms of hiring and promotion, et cetera. But like, that's one of the ways that I just haven't seen it done. I feel like that often happens. I've seen so many women, many of them women of color, devoting themselves to this work because it matters to them, and it's burning them out because they care about these things, and then no one's sort of rewarding them for that. They're kind of ignoring it. And I think it's time to really uplift that as a skill and as a critical skill, especially now and for sure moving forward.
I also think for the longest, there's been this false narrative that, you know, purpose will pay the bills and that purpose is enough to keep people in these seats. The fact that the majority of museums are having trouble filling their open roles, you mentioned 60%, is actually a good narrative to disprove that purpose is the only thing that will get people through the doors, and that there are millions of people who are waiting for that same job, so you better accept the compensation that we're giving you. I don't think we can move forward without addressing pay. It's one of the key tools for equity across the sector, for being able to bring in future workers who can afford their living expenses and to have the field not just rely on those who can afford to take a lesser compensation. I think that's a really important narrative here that we need to shift toward. But as you mentioned, The money it's limited. The funds are limited. And so you can't really increase pay without either increasing the entire annual budget, that size of the pie, or decreasing the number of workers and paying them more fairly, which might mean that institutions have to do a little less programmatically every year. It might mean that as we think about the ambitious capital campaigns that are put forth by a lot of the large institutions, that baking in those salary increases into those general operating costs have to happen. But the reality is that the compensation model in the sector is broken. We know that 58% of a museum's annual budget on average already goes to compensation and benefits. You can't actually increase the percentage all that much, but you either have to decrease your worker force or increase the revenue that you're bringing in order to make these compensations actually viable for the majority of workers.
Thank you for bringing that up. Both the point about the fact that capital campaigns tend to drive increases in size and programming that then need to be supported with staffing, which often isn't covered by the capital campaign. Though I see some very savvy museums building that in.
Yep.
The other thing is what has been referred to as the overhead myth, that somehow a large percentage of your budget being devoted to staff somehow shows that you're inefficient. And for a long time, funders bought into that myth and would say, oh, you're an inefficient organization because 80% of your budget is going to staff. It's like, well, that's who does the work. So I really applaud the growing awareness on the part of funders that that is actually a complex metric and doesn't signal inefficiency. Jen, did you have anything to say about this point?
I was looking at the chat, and I have a couple of questions from there that I thought we could potentially pull in, but let me pause in case there's more you want to round out on this part of the discussion.
Oh, I just wanted to mention a piece of data that, again, dug up in my rabbit hole diving as I looked at these questions, which is recent research that you said you had seen as well, indicating, this was in the UK, I believe, but it's fairly recent, saying that the vast majority of wellness initiatives in companies actually have no results, with the one exception being giving people supported time to do volunteering for things that they cared about, which was a result that's kind of discouraging, but very interesting.
Well, I kind of want to address that because I saw that article and talked about it with some people, including some of the folks in this room. But I think part of that is also just like thinking about the approach, right? Like, again, in a capitalist society, buying more stuff or like doing more things isn't necessarily going to like fix the issue, which is that we're doing too much stuff and that we're not doing a good job with the resources that we have. And, you know, look, I'm here in Southern California. I believe in things like, you know, self-care and yoga, probably more so than many of, you know, my colleagues within museums. I'm not going to pretend those things aren't really important and valuable, but as a workplace, if you can make people feel like you care what they think, and you don't have to be a manager to do that. You could just be a person in the meeting saying like, wait, I'm sorry, you actually interrupted. I heard her talking. Could you let her, like, there are also like really basic kind of decision-making strategies, which we try to practice in MMF that I've never seen museums do, which is just be aware of the way that power and privilege and hierarchy just, you know, does what it does in every room. And that like, if we just start to be a little more aware and we just kind of like change our actual working practices, again, this is free, you know, to let people be heard doesn't cost you something. It means that the people, again, leading, or even just the people that are kind of in a position that they can speak up to do that work, you know, have to be sort of rewarded for it. But I do think that there is this way in which we think like, oh, people are suffering, let's buy them something, rather than saying like, the real root of the issue here is that they feel unheard. They feel that nobody cares what they think. They feel like they have no voice in literally anything. And that's far more damaging than, you know, whatever other, you know, sort of ailments are happening. So I guess I appreciate some people seeing that in the chat and talking about that piece, because I think it's important, but that's where I think the root of the issue is, which is that we don't need more things or like to add, which, you know, and to be fair, like some of those things are great. I'm not trying to say we shouldn't have those things, but it feels like we're missing the point.
Thank you.
And that we don't necessarily need those provided by our workplace. I think some of those wellness initiatives can feel almost wasteful, especially in work environments where you feel like you're being undercompensated. So many workers would prefer to have that extra money in their paycheck to be able to pay their rent or mortgage that month, as opposed to having lunchtime yoga. if they choose to explore yoga outside of work, that's something that they can value and do with their own money. But I think what Mia was bringing up around some of the things that can be done fairly inexpensively, that worker empowerment, these volunteer programs, that brings people into touch with a mission, with their feeling of purpose in a way that their day-to-day roles might not allow. And it's almost seen as this benefit, this luxury that workers are able to take time away from the thing that you have compensated them to do, to connect with their local community in a way that matters to them. So again, that purpose gap that we were talking about in your first question is almost answered very neatly by giving workers the opportunity to step away from their day-to-day work in order to connect more meaningfully with their communities.
I would say too, there's some interesting evidence around the possibility of promotion and opportunity for growth, which we hear in this study a lot as a place of discontentment, a place that's a motivator for moving outside of one's own organization. There's an interesting study by Prince that I'm happy to share that includes 3 factors that are important to career growth, which I think are fascinating. One is advancement plans, like having a plan in place for what your advancement looks like, what the paths are. Another is internal promotion, actually seeing a manifestation of that happening. And then the third is accurate career previews, which I thought was such a fascinating framing for being in alignment with the reality of your organization, right? That if your sense is that you're going to be promoted within the first year and it takes 10 years on average, how do you get that knowledge? How do you understand what's possible in this organization? Where is it now? Where is it aspirationally growing towards? And I think that aligns with Mia, what I've heard you share a lot around, like being transparent with workers and having more clarity about like, what is the situation now? And is the institution working towards something different, something better? And what's the time frame for that? And how do you find yourself within that structure so that you can make informed decisions about your future?
I think I suspect that in many museums, one of the limiting factors for advancement is that within any given area of work, it's such a shallow range of position. Yeah. How far up can you go? 2 of the most inspiring examples I've seen at some museums are museums that intentionally provide formalized cross-training. So maybe you've been hired in marketing, but you can have an internal internship to cross-train in development. Okay, so that gives you more opportunities either within the museum or to learn a new career. And the other is one museum, which I don't know if I have permission to name them, so they will go nameless, which uses as a formal metric of success the number of entry-level employees they successfully train up in place in other organizations, because they know they can't all get promoted inside the museum, so they see themselves as a training ground for people who move on to other organizations.
I'm glad you brought that up, Elizabeth, because that's something that I would really love to see more of in the field, which I think, again, points back to what Jen was mentioning around just needing to be real with people. Like, again, you know, these are like very smart, intelligent, and in a lot of cases, overly educated folks that like, they get it. They know that not every single person in the entry level is going to get to be a museum director. And by the way, a lot of them don't even want to do management per our data, right? People see that and they're like, oh. So it's not necessarily that everybody wants to be promoted. I think it's more about, yeah, that sense of meaning and purpose, that sense of growth, that like learning. I mean, we're humans, like people are designed, literally, we're curious, we want to learn stuff. Nobody wants to be like press the same button all day long and see nothing for the rest of their lives. Like that's not, that's not the model for well-being. So I think that if institutions could be more real, and I don't know which institution you're talking about, although I think I have a couple ideas. If we could get to a place where as a field, we could say things like, hey, look, these are the kinds of organizations, or if you're later in a manager in a hiring position to say, hey, look, this is how our organization works. Most people come here and or in the position like yours and they stay, you know, 2 to 3 years. Some people in this level, they may move into this bracket and they'll stay 3 to 5 years, and be really real with what those possibilities are, what those pay levels are, and say, and look, and if you reach that point and there isn't an opportunity here, or you're looking for something else, like we want to support you, because that is the real service to the field. And I would love there just to be a little more, I guess, less shame and just more like reality about that. Because I've for sure worked in institutions where I knew I was only going to be there for a few years and it was a stepping stone. And there's nothing wrong with that. I used to get judged for that as a worker, right? People would be like, oh, well, she only came here for a few years. Well, it's like, but what do you expect? You know, I see there's no opportunity for me here, and that's fine. so I'm going to move on. But I think it would be so wonderful if managers could just say that, especially the workers that are just kind of like new to the field and trying to figure it out. Because if they do, then people can just decide for themselves. And we can all just be very mature adults and say, this is what's possible. This is what's not. Here's how things generally go, you know, and I just don't see enough of that, like courage to just be honest. And I think workers deserve that respect.
Well, I think it's because it reflects a fundamental existential shift in the role of the museum as a workplace, because career planning is still a very novel concept for a lot of these institutions. They're so focused on their public programs and the exhibitions and everything that happens very visibly. But blowing the lid open on the institution and saying, no, this is a workplace where our employees should be cultivated and developed, where we can demystify it and take away the stigma of job hopping, right, from institution to institution, and actively work with our employees to help them chart their larger career trajectories. Those are all novel concepts in our sector. And so, go on, Elizabeth.
I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, I'm done with my thought.
I was just going to say, I'm a big fan of looking at your metrics of success. And as long as what's a successful museum that gets reported to the members and the board of trustees is the number of exhibitions and program participants and collections, that's what people are going to focus on. You know, is there an annual report that can say, and this is the number of people who received internal promotions, or the number of people who wrote notes of appreciation saying, I wouldn't have gotten this job at another organization except for the training and mentoring you gave me. I want to be cognizant of time. We're only 10 minutes from the end. And Jen, you had mentioned you had seen some questions in the Q&A that you would like to address.
There's so many great ones. I'm gonna sort of go back. There's a, I think, really helpful observation about how many marginalized workers are concentrated at entry levels and focus on diversifying staff for internships, but also at leadership. So there's this kind of bifurcation of where support programs seem to exist. And just a curiosity about any recommendations this group might have about those who are in the middle, right? Who are sort of stuck in this middle place and not being promoted and not seeing supports.
I mean, I think it dovetails with the conversation we were just having, where yes, we do see a large amount of diversity at the top and the bottom of the institutions, first led by entry level, and then next diverse cohort in terms of level of seniority is the executive level. But those folks in the messy middle, they do need a whole lot of support for their workload. They're the ones who are probably feeling the pangs, right? They want career opportunities. They want to be able to move to that next level or to have a larger domain of impact. Sometimes that comes with a new title and new pay, right? Or full promotions. But that can also happen experientially. If there's a new initiative or project that person wants to launch, being able to empower them to have more opportunities in their current workplace is absolutely a way forward, right? Working hand in hand with those folks. But the other way is to have more career mobility laterally to other institutions of different sizes, different focuses, to allow them to build their functional expertise in new geographies, new domains, and taking away some of that shame and blame that comes with job switching, I think, is a large part of the conversation here. But the other part is actually allowing people to job craft, to build careers that can perhaps be more relevant to that worker and their communities, something that the field might not have done before. There's a willingness to follow the worker as opposed to letting the institution dictate what every single employee does every day.
Anything else you'd like to pick out of the queue?
Yeah, it's tough because there's a lot here. There's one question in here that's from fairly early in our discussion, just really thinking about how museums have started to adopt some of the structures of for-profit entities and organizations in terms of sometimes aligning compensation, in terms of retention or professional development, and an interest in how distinct should these workplaces be going forward? Is there momentum or power in kind of pulling from what might be working in the private sector versus leaning into the kind of purpose-driven distinction of art museums? And I'm not quite sure where I sit on that. I don't know. I think it's a really fascinating question about which direction are we moving, and do we want to try to accelerate or put the gas on one of those directions? I'm curious what you all may have observed around those patterns.
I mean, I can offer some initial observations just from even my work as a strategist and advisor to many cultural institutions over the last decade. We have seen a professionalization of the field where functions are well defined and there's a clear kind of standard of excellence for every function, and depending on the size and the tenured history of that institution, it will feel more or less corporate, right? So the largest, most resource organizations feel quite similar to a Procter & Gamble. You know, they feel most sort of corporate akin. And then the ones that are just getting started or perhaps looking to alternative models or haven't been steeped in the same corporate practices as some of the larger organizations. I think that it would be a shame for us to replicate some of the harm that is done in those environments in our sector. But there is a bit of the kind of standard of what excellence looks like and what career trajectories look like and what compensation structures and promotions and salaries should look like, that clarity that comes from some of these corporate settings that our field could really benefit from. But we can't lose sight of the mission that brought folks in. And I think one resounding finding that we found in the study is that we do need to do a better job as a field in connecting people back to that core mission, even if their role is in building operations or in communications or as an administrator, that maybe that volunteer day that is so effective, right, in that UK study can be used to have our cultural workers engage with our audiences and our communities at least once a year. So I do think that purpose side can't be lost, but that there is opportunity to learn from the stated expectations and the clarity that's provided in corporate settings that can be applied to the field here.
I'd love to sneak in one more question from my list and give you each a chance to answer it quickly, which is, sparked by the initial results, what new question would you like to ask the next time round? Because as my understanding is, the ambition is we'll do this every 2 years.
Yes, so much. Can I do my super quick hit list?
Yeah.
I'd like to think more holistically about livable wages. I think we started to chip at that, but we'd like to understand household size and household income and caregiving responsibilities and a broader constellation of what influences that. That we'd like to understand perceptions of inclusion, diversity, and equity within organizations. And I think we hear consistently that benchmarking against US workers overall is incredibly powerful in understanding where we sit as a field and where there might be models to learn from. And so doing more of that in the kinds of questions that we ask could be a great benefit.
Diane or Mia, do you have anything on your hit lists?
That's kind of our combined hit list that Jen's been keeping track of.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to do that.
No, that was great.
So
That was
much.
great. There's lots of things I would say that we've asked that we sort of want to double click on or add an option to. And so much of that has come directly from events like this, stakeholders, people reaching out to us. So this is actually a very opportune moment to say, like, if you take a peek at our report, or if you're looking at our data and you have a question or you want to add something, that's actually the way that we kind of tally where the drumbeat is the loudest. So our report is online. You could read it as a PDF, but it's also literally a website on our page. And I think someone's putting some things in the chat, but you can submit a comment there. It's totally anonymous. I don't know who you are. You don't tell us, you don't have to say anything about who you are, but if you say, I'd like to see more on this, or I have a suggestion here, like we read every single one of those. So please, submit comments there. That's helpful, always helpful to get a sense from the stakeholders about what else you would like to see.
Diane, do you have a wish list question you would throw in?
There are a million. I guess the only that I'd add is the dimension of career trajectory. I want to know what these workers are looking to do, how they're looking to grow, where might they consider going next if it's within the sector, outside of the sector, where have they been before their current institution, to understand how many job hops have already happened, what sizes of institutions they tend to navigate throughout their career. Because if we can offer a few models about how folks are building their careers in this sector, we might actually be able to support that moving forward as opposed to just documenting it.
And I see Monica has come in. I think she's going to tell us we have to wrap up.
We have hit our time, and I just want to say the chat and the Q&A space, which became a chat space, was really, just animated, and folks are really connected to the data, really connected to new questions. And so I will say to our audience that we will review many of the questions that we missed. There were just way too many. We'll connect with our panel to be able to provide a response. I want to encourage you to stay connected with museums moving forward. They have a newsletter. Our team will be dropping some links in so that you can stay connected to their work via the newsletter. They also have social media platforms that we encourage you to stay connected to as well, and an in-person event in February in the Bay Area. So if you are a local of the Bay Area and you would like to continue this conversation, there is an event. So there's so much coming from this team, and we're so thankful to have each of you, and thankful to you, Elizabeth, for leading a wonderful moderated conversation. You were so skilled in bringing in all of the conversations that were happening in our chat and some of the conversations that we were having internally into this space. So with that, I want to thank our audience for joining us for a wonderful conversation. We do hope that you stay connected with SMU DataArts and our research on psychological well-being in the future. We're so thankful for your partnership. With that, I think we're at our hour mark. We did it, guys. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and thank you for joining. We're going to go ahead and close our webinar space. Thank you.
Thanks,
Have a
all.
great one.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all.
Everyone.